Sometimes a story is just a story, but more often than not, they are a lesson cloaked in entertainment. The stories I share here are definitely the latter. Some are fact, some are fiction, all are beneficial. Hello, my name is Earl Breon, and you are listening to the Leadership Chronicles. Hello everyone, this story is titled The Other Ride. We all know of Paul Revere and his midnight ride. And if you were really keen on history and paid attention, you might remember the name William Dawes. And if you were really just into Revolutionary War riders, you might know the name of Jack Jouett. Pretty sure I'm not pronouncing that last name correctly, but I couldn't find a key to help me out. But how many of you know of the fourth very important war rider? Now, granted, this one happened a couple years after the British had already invaded, but by many accounts, this one was just as, if not more important than the previous three. You see, on April 26, Colonel Henry Ludington received intelligence that the British were marching on Danbury, Connecticut. This was terrible news because Danbury housed one of the biggest supply houses for the Continental Army at the time. Not having telephones or social media to alert his troops, Colonel Ludington turned to the fastest method of the time and dispatched a rider. He gave the rider the message and briefed them on the route to take and the threats to be on guard for. Now, I won't name all of the towns the rider visited, but it covered most of 2 counties in New York, with a swing by Danbury, Connecticut to give the townsfolk a heads up that the British were on their way. All in all, the ride covered about 40 miles overnight and through rough terrain. Now, that may not sound like a whole lot on its own, but remember they were on horseback and they rode for approximately 10 to 12 hours through those conditions. Now, as if the duration and distance of the ride wasn't enough, this rider had to dodge British troops who were already on land, evade those who were still loyal to the crown and trying to squash the Continental Army's efforts, and even defend themselves against the occasional highwaymen who tried to rob them and steal their horse. Remember, the horse was the one possession they desperately needed the most at the time. Good news is, they succeeded in their mission, and by the time they made it home, most of the militia had already assembled and were ready to march and defend Danbury. The bad news is, they were too late for Danbury. They did lessen the attack, just not prevent it. You see, the intelligence had just reached Colonel Ludington too late for him to organize and move his troops despite the heroic efforts of the rider. But, back to good news. Because of this, they were in position to help at the Battle of Ridgefield and drive General William Tryon back to Long Island. William Tryon was the British governor of New York at the time. So New York was saved by the heroic deeds of Ludington, and many years later the town of Ludingtonville, New York was named to honor those actions. Now, by now, you're probably thinking that I'm talking about Colonel Ludington again, but let me clarify. Ludingtonville was renamed to honor the rider that night, Colonel Ludington's 16-year-old daughter, Sybil. Yep, you heard that right. The rider that saved New York was a 16-year-old girl. She assembled a militia, evaded capture, and beat the heck out of at least one would-be robber trying to steal her horse. And she did it all with a stick, a ton of courage, and a lot of determination. And this wasn't the first time that she had been a hero. Previously, a group of British loyalists had attempted to capture her father, the colonel. Sybil sprung to action, lit a bunch of candles around the house, and organized her brothers and sisters, of which she had 11, to march in front of the windows as if they were soldiers. She must have done a really good job at this because she fooled the loyalists and they fled the farm. Now, fast forward to modern times, where we make statements like, 16 is too young for X, or worse, women can't do Y. Just think of if Colonel Ludington had had that mentality back then and just outright dismissed his daughter. Could anybody else have made that ride successfully? Who knows? Maybe one of his sons could have. But what we do know is that he had the confidence in her. She was the one that was chosen, and she succeeded. Had she not, who knows how the war may have turned. If he had picked someone else who would have failed, who knows how the war may have turned. So with that in mind, let me ask you some growth questions here. What are your personal biases? And I promise you, you do have them. We all do. But what are your personal biases about who can do what? Where do those biases come from? Do you know? Can you think of a time where those biases may have kept you from picking the best person for the job at hand? When it's time to make a critical decision, can you put those biases aside to make the right call? Ladies and gentlemen, there you have it. The story of Sybil Ludington and the other late night ride. Closing out this episode is a little bittersweet for me since it's the last episode of the series. You see, I started this episode to get used to podcasting, editing audio, and, posting episodes and interacting with folks. I just wanted to get the first podcast under my belt. Now, I fell in love with it, and I really wish I could continue, and I will continue in some capacity in future projects. But sadly, the free Spreaker account for this one is all used up by the time I post this episode. Now, I hope you all have enjoyed listening to this as much as I have creating this podcast. Please feel free to continue to share it and ask yourself those growth questions and share them with others. Let them ask them, talk about them together. Because I really hope that these stories and the growth questions have helped you become better afterwards. Now, as I said, as for me, this isn't my last podcast by a long shot. I've already got 2 other projects in the works, and that's why I've chose to go ahead and end this one here, because I think the other 2 are going to be just as, if not more valuable and on bigger platforms. So, what I will ask is, if you do still have any ideas or suggestions, whether it's stories, whether it's comments on the audio, whatever it is, please still hit me. I'm still going to monitor the accounts, and I'll use that information in the next 2 projects. And I will let y'all know what those projects are through social media when they launch. Right now, the target date for at least one of those is going to be the beginning of August. So until then, I really want to thank everyone for joining and listening in and going through and joining me on this ride. Pun intended for this episode. I look forward to bringing you more content in those other projects and look forward to really getting to interact and grow with you more. And please just remember one thing out of this series if you remember nothing else. The better you know your history, the more prepared you are for your future. And with that, I'm out.